High above the Reich in the bleeding spring of 1944, a silver phantom tore through the clouds, outturning the absolute best fighters the Luftwaffe had to offer. For months, the American P-51 Mustang had been a ghost, a lethal rumor, whispering fire and death to German pilots. But what happens when the enemy finally captures the ghost? What occurs when a highly decorated German ace climbs into the cockpit of the ultimate Allied weapon? What he discovered at 25,000 feet wasn't just a mechanical marvel. It was a death sentence for the Third Reich. When he finally landed, his chilling words to the high command shocked them to their core. This is the untold story of the beast that broke the eagle. The mud of the French countryside was still slick with the morning's rain when Hauptmann Felix Steiger stepped out of the staff car. His heavy leather flying jacket, scuffed and worn from 4 years of relentless combat, offered little protection against the biting wind of early March. 1944. He adjusted his Knight's Cross at his collar, a heavy piece of iron that felt more like a gravestone these days than an award. Steiger was a veteran of the Eastern Front and the defense of the Reich, boasting 82 confirmed aerial victories. He knew every rivet of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G, knew the exact vibration of its Daimler-Benz engine right before it stalled, and knew the smell of his own sweat when a British Spitfire locked onto his tail. But recently, he had been transferred from his frontline Jägerschwader to a highly classified unit, the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, commanded by Hauptmann Theodor Rosarius. The Wandering Circus had a singular, morbid purpose. They were the Luftwaffe's premier test squadron for captured Allied aircraft. Their job was to repair, fly, and evaluate enemy fighters, then tour frontline German air bases to teach regular pilots the blind spots and weaknesses of the machines killing them. "Over here, Steiger," a voice called out. Theodor Rosarius himself was standing at the edge of a shallow crater in a farmer's field near Cambrai. Beside him stood a contingent of nervous Wehrmacht infantry who had secured the perimeter. Steiger walked over, his boots sinking into the wet earth. As he crested the ridge of the crater, his breath caught in his throat. There it lay, the rumor, the ghost. It was an American P-51B Mustang. It had belly landed, carving a 200-yard trench through the beet field before coming to a violent, shuddering halt. Its four-bladed Hamilton Standard propeller was bent backward into grotesque hooks, and its silver aluminum skin was streaked with black engine oil and mud. But otherwise, the machine was miraculously intact. "Flak hit," Rosarius explained, his voice low, almost reverent. A lucky 37mm shell grazed the belly radiator. Engine overheated, coolant leaked out, and the Yankee pilot had to put her down. He tried to burn it, but the wet ground and a quick response from a local patrol stopped him. The pilot is already on a train to Stalag Luft III. Steiger slid down the muddy embankment, approaching the downed bird. It was massive, significantly larger than his cramped Bf 109. The lines of the aircraft were disturbingly clean. There were no drag-inducing radiator scoops jutting awkwardly from the nose. Instead, a sleek belly scoop sat flush under the fuselage. The wings were broad and flat, featuring a strange, smooth airfoil design Steiger had only read about in intelligence briefings, the fabled laminar flow wing. "She is beautiful, isn't she?" Rosarius murmured, stepping up beside him. General of the fighters, Adolf Galland has been screaming at intelligence for a working model for months. The Americans are escorting their B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Our command says it's impossible. A fighter cannot have the range of a heavy bomber and still outturn a Focke-Wulf. Yet they are doing it. We are bleeding out in the skies, Felix. Steiger ran a gloved hand along the leading edge of the wing. The aluminum was remarkably smooth, the rivets puttied and sanded down to reduce even a fraction of aerodynamic drag. It was a level of manufacturing quality that Germany, crippled by relentless bombing and material shortages, could no longer dream of achieving. He hoisted himself up onto the wing root and peered into the cockpit. The canopy had been slid back. Inside, it smelled of high-octane aviation fuel, cold metal, and a faint trace of American tobacco. The instrument panel was a marvel of logical arrangement, a far cry from the chaotic, afterthought placement of dials in a Messerschmitt. But it was what he found resting on the pilot's seat that made his blood run cold. It was a piece of heavy cardstock, torn from a flight log. Written in thick, bold pencil were the words, "To Jerry, take care of my girl. See you in Berlin. Lieutenant Miller." Steiger handed the card to Rosarius. The commander read it, his jaw tightening. "Arrogant bastards." "They have a right to be," Steiger said quietly, his eyes sweeping over the heavy, 50 caliber machine guns protruding from the wings. "If this machine is half of what our bomber pilots claim it is, they hold the sky." Rosarius folded the card and tucked it into his coat. "That is what you are going to find out, Felix. The recovery crews are bringing cranes and flatbeds. We are taking her to the secret testing facility at Göttingen. Our engineers will strip her down, fix the radiator, replace the propeller, and paint her in our colors. And then, you are going to take her up." Steiger looked from the commander to the crashed Mustang. A deep, unsettling knot formed in his stomach. He had fought the Americans, respected their bravery, and cursed their numbers. But getting inside the skin of the beast, flying the very weapon designed to exterminate his comrades, it felt like a betrayal. "You want me to find its weakness," Steiger said. "I want you to find a way for us to survive," Rosarius corrected him. "Because if this aircraft is truly without a flaw, the war is already over." 2 weeks later, deep within the heavily guarded hangars of the Göttingen test facility, the ghost was resurrected. The air in the hangar was thick with the smell of grease, hot metal, and the anxious sweat of German aviation engineers. Oberfeldwebel Weber, the chief mechanic of the Zirkus Rosarius, stood beneath the wings of the Mustang, a wrench in his grease-stained hands. He looked like a man who had just dismantled a bomb, only to find another bomb inside it. Steiger walked into the hangar, dressed in his flight suit. He stopped dead in his tracks. The transformation was striking. The American olive drab and silver finish had been completely painted over. The entire underside of the aircraft, right up to the mid-fuselage, was painted a blazing, high-visibility yellow, the standard marking for captured Allied aircraft to prevent overzealous German anti-aircraft gunners from blowing them out of the sky. On the tail, the wings, and the fuselage, massive black Balkenkreuz, German crosses, had been painted. The aircraft's new designation, T9+CK, was stenciled on the side. It looked like a prisoner of war forced into an enemy uniform. "Report, Weber," Steiger said, not taking his eyes off the machine. Weber wiped his forehead with a rag. "Herr Hauptmann, I have been turning wrenches for 20 years. I worked on Junkers, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs. I have never seen anything like this. The engineering. It is terrifyingly brilliant." "Explain." Weber led Steiger to the nose of the aircraft, where the engine cowlings had been removed. Resting on the engine mounts was the heart of the beast. "This is the Packard V1650, Weber said, pointing to the massive supercharged V12 engine. "It is a British Rolls-Royce Merlin, built under license by the Americans at the Packard Motor Car Company. Our Daimler-Benz engines rely on direct fuel injection. The Americans are using an updraft carburetor. By all our calculations, it should be inferior. It should sputter when pushed into negative G-forces." "But it doesn't?" Steiger asked. "It does," briefly, Weber nodded. "But look at the two-stage, two-speed supercharger. The engineering tolerances are microscopic. It compresses the thin air at high altitudes so efficiently that this engine will produce over 1,500 horsepower at 25,000 feet. Where our engines gasp for breath, this one breathes fire." Steiger frowned, feeling the cold weight of the reality pressing down on him. "And the range? How are they flying from England to Berlin?" Weber's expression darkened. He walked to the wing route. "This was the twist that shocked us, Herr Hauptmann. We drained the fuel systems. The wings hold 184 gallons. That alone is impressive. But then we found another tank." Weber patted the fuselage, right behind the pilot's seat. An 85-gallon self-sealing tank sitting right behind the pilot, fully loaded, with external drop tanks, This aircraft carries over 400 gallons of aviation fuel. It is a flying bomb. It can fly for nearly 6 hours. Steiger stared at the fuselage tank. 85 gallons right behind the pilot's spine? That shifts the center of gravity drastically to the rear. It must handle like a drunken pig when fully loaded. Exactly, Weber said, a rare smile appearing. For the first hour of flight, until that rear tank is drained, the Mustang is tail-heavy, unstable, prone to snapping into a spin if maneuvered too violently. That is its vulnerability. But by the time they reach our airspace over the Rhine or Berlin, Steiger murmured, realizing the grim truth. That tank is empty. The weight shifts forward. The beast becomes light, balanced, and deadly. Yes, Weber sighed. By the time they meet you, they are in their ultimate fighting form. Steiger nodded slowly, digesting the information. He climbed onto the left wing and stepped down into the cockpit. The mechanics had reupholstered the seat, but the controls remained purely American. He gripped the control stick. It felt substantial, precise. He pushed the rudder pedals. They were perfectly tensioned. He looked at the canopy. It was the Razorback design, framed with heavy metal struts. Visibility to the rear was poor, a distinct disadvantage. But the Americans had installed a British Malcolm hood, a bulged perspex canopy, that allowed the pilot to stick his head out slightly and look back. As he sat there in the quiet of the hangar, Steiger closed his eyes. He tried to channel the man who had sat here before him, Lieutenant Miller. He pictured the young American, likely well-fed, highly trained, with hundreds of hours of flight time in safe skies, before ever seeing combat. Steiger thought of his own newly minted wingmen, boys of 18 with barely 50 hours of flight time, thrown into the meat grinder against armadas of heavily armed bombers and these silver wolves. Herr Hauptmann, Weber called up. The radiator is patched. The American propeller was beyond repair, but we managed to fit a modified blade from an old captured Spitfire. It will hold. The guns are fully loaded. General Galland wants a live fire evaluation after the flight test. Understood, Steiger said, opening his eyes. The dials on the dash stared back at him in English. Altimeter, manifold pressure, airspeed. He ran his thumb over the red firing button on the control stick. Tomorrow, he would take this machine into the sky. He would push it to its breaking point. He had to find a flaw, a violent stall characteristic, a stiffening of the controls in a dive, anything that he could write in his report. If he couldn't find a weakness to exploit, the Luftwaffe was doomed. Fuel her up, Weber, Steiger ordered, climbing out of the cockpit. Tomorrow, I wear the enemy's skin. The morning of the test flight was stark and clear. The blue sky, a vast, empty arena above Göttingen. Steiger sat strapped into the Mustang, the heavy canvas belts digging into his shoulders. Outside, the ground crew stood clear, holding fire extinguishers, their faces a mix of awe and deep apprehension. Clear! Steiger yelled out the open window. He flipped the magneto switches, primed the engine, and engaged the starter. The massive Packard Merlin engine groaned, coughed, and then violently roared to life. The entire airframe shuddered with a deep, guttural vibration that rattled Steiger's teeth. It sounded entirely different from a German engine. There was a high-pitched, metallic whine from the supercharger that underscored the deep, rhythmic thrum of the V-12 exhaust. A thick cloud of blue smoke blew past the cockpit as the engine caught its rhythm. Steiger checked his gauges. Oil pressure normal. Coolant temperature rising steadily. Manifold pressure steady. He advanced the throttle. The Mustang lurched forward, feeling incredibly heavy on the ground. As he taxied to the grass runway, the long nose completely blocked his forward vision. He had to zigzag, turning the aircraft to see what was in front of him, a common trait in tail draggers. But the Mustang's nose seemed exceptionally long. At the end of the runway, he lined up, locked the tail wheel, and took a deep breath. Show me what you are, he thought. He pushed the throttle forward to 54 inches of manifold pressure. The response was immediate and terrifying. The acceleration pressed him hard against the seat. The roar of the Merlin drowned out his own thoughts. The tail lifted almost instantly. Steiger danced on the rudder pedals to counteract the massive torque of the propeller, pulling him to the left. At 110 miles per hour, he gently pulled back on the stick. The Mustang broke ground not with the aggressive leap of a lightweight BF-109, but with the smooth, inevitable power of a locomotive. Steiger retracted the landing gear. The heavy clunk of the wheels, locking into the wheel wells, reverberated through the floorboards. He pointed the nose toward the heavens and initiated a climb. This was the first test. German fighters were renowned for their climbing ability. Interceptors designed to scramble and gain altitude quickly. He expected the heavy American machine to struggle. He was wrong. The altimeter needle swept upward with dizzying speed. 5,000 feet, 10,000, 15,000. The supercharger kicked into its high-speed blower, and Steiger felt a secondary surge of power push him higher. At 20,000 feet, where his BF-109 would begin to feel sluggish, the controls growing mushy in the thin air, the Mustang felt like it was just waking up. "Steiger, this is Yellow Leader," a voice crackled in his headset. It was Lieutenant Heinrich, flying a pristine Focke-Wulf 4190A8, acting as his sparring partner for the mock engagement. "I have you in sight, Angels 25. You look ridiculous in that yellow paint." "Focus, Heinrich," Steiger replied, banking the Mustang. The ailerons were incredibly light and responsive. "Let's see what this beast can do." "Approach from my 6 o'clock. High. We simulate a standard boom and zoom attack." Steiger leveled off at 25,000 feet. The cold in the cockpit was intense, but the pressurized heating system, a luxury unknown in his German fighters, kept him comfortable. He checked his 6 o'clock. Heinrich's 190, a brutal, radial-engine butcher bird, was diving down from the sun. "Here I come," Heinrich called out. Steiger waited until the FW-190 was within simulated firing range. Then, he slammed the stick hard over and kicked the rudder, executing a violent brake turn to the left. The Mustang responded with an agility that defied its weight. The laminar flow wing bit into the thin air, pulling a tight, high G turn. Steiger's vision narrowed slightly as the G-forces pressed the blood from his head. He looked over his shoulder. Heinrich had missed the firing window. The Focke-Wulf was trying to pull inside Steiger's turn, but the heavy German fighter was bleeding speed rapidly. "I am losing energy," Heinrich grunted over the radio. "Trying to follow your turn." "Don't," Steiger muttered to himself. He knew the FW-190's weakness. In a matter of seconds, the Mustang had outturned the Focke-Wulf. Steiger reversed his bank, rolled over the top, and dropped right onto Heinrich's tail. He had the German cross of the Fru 190 perfectly centered in his reflector sight. "I have you, Heinrich. You are dead." "Verdammt," Heinrich swore. "Okay, breaking off. Let's test the dive." No one outdives a Focke-Wulf. Heinrich pushed his nose over, pushing his throttle to the firewall. The 190 plummeted toward the earth like a heavy stone, a tactic German pilots used to escape slower Allied fighters. Steiger pushed the stick forward and followed him down. The airspeed indicator wound up rapidly. 300 miles per hour. 400. 450. In a Messerschmitt, at these speeds, the control surfaces would compress. The stick would feel like it was set in concrete, requiring immense physical strength just to pull out of the dive. But as the Mustang hurtled past 450 miles per hour, Steiger moved the stick. It was stiff, yes, but still entirely manageable. The aerodynamics of the airframe were so incredibly clean that the aircraft sliced through the air with minimal drag. He was gaining on the FW-190. He was catching the best diving fighter in the Luftwaffe, and he wasn't even at full throttle. Suddenly, a massive shudder ripped through the Mustang. Steiger's heart leaped into his throat. Was the airframe breaking apart? Was the tail fluttering? He checked the gauges. Nothing. Then he looked out the canopy. A shadow passed over him. "Steiger! Brake! Brake!" Heinrich screamed over the radio, pure panic lacing his voice. "Bandits! 3 o'clock high! Real bandits!" Steiger wrenched his neck to the right. Diving out of a wispy cirrus cloud were 4 silver teardrops. P-51 Mustangs. 8th Air Force. They were deep in German territory, hunting for targets of opportunity. and they had just spotted a lone Focke-Wulf 190 diving away, closely pursued by a bright yellow Mustang adorned with massive, insulting Nazi crosses. The hunters had found an abomination. "Heinrich, split S and dive for the deck," Steiger ordered, adrenaline flooding his system. "Get into the flak zones." "They are ignoring me," Heinrich yelled. "They are going for you. They see the crosses." Steiger looked back. The 4 American Mustangs had ignored the FW-190 entirely. They were swooping down, formation tight, the sun glinting off their polished aluminum wings. To them, Steiger wasn't just an enemy. He was a desecration of their own machine. Steiger slammed the throttle forward, pushing it past the red line, engaging the emergency power, WEP. The Merlin engine screamed, a deafening howl that vibrated into Steiger's very bones. He was in an American plane, wearing German crosses, being hunted by Americans over Germany. And as the tracers from the leading American 6.50 caliber machine guns lashed out, whipping past his canopy like strings of angry fire, Steiger realized the ultimate, horrifying twist of his mission. He wasn't testing the beast to find its weakness. He was testing it to realize there wasn't one. And now, he had to use the enemy's own perfect machine to survive the enemy. The sky above Lower Saxony instantly transformed into a lethal, swirling vortex of silver and blazing yellow. Steiger was pinned to his seat as the captured Mustang hurled itself forward, the Merlin engine screaming at 61 inches of manifold pressure. White-hot lines of tracer fire from the leading American P-51 snapped past his right wing, so close he could see the smoke trailing from the incendiary rounds. "Brake, Steiger, they are boxing you in." Heinrich's voice was a desperate crackle of static. The Focke-Wulf was already plunging toward the safety of the cloud layer below, but Steiger had no such luxury. He was the primary target. To the Americans, seeing their thoroughbred painted in the garish yellow of the Zircus rosarius and branded with the Balkenkreuz was an insult that demanded immediate, violent correction. Steiger hauled the stick back and to the right, attempting a climbing barrel roll to throw off the attacker's aim. But as he applied the heavy elevator input, the horrific reality of the Mustang's design flaw violently reared its head. The 85-gallon fuselage tank, sitting right behind his armor-plated seat, was still completely full. As the G-forces built up, the massive shift in the center of gravity acted like a pendulum swinging out of control. The Mustang's nose whipped upward with terrifying, uncommanded violence. The aircraft shuddered, the laminar flow wings suddenly losing its grip on the thin air. In a fraction of a second, the sleek fighter snapped into a vicious, high-speed stall. Steiger's head slammed against the side of the Malcolm Hood canopy. The horizon spun into a blur of blue sky and brown earth. He was totally out of control at 22,000 feet, but it was this exact, terrifying instability that saved his life. The American flight leader, anticipating a smooth, predictable pursuit curve, fired a lethal burst exactly where Steiger's yellow Mustang should have been. Instead, Steiger's aircraft violently tumbled out of the flight path. The American shot past him, missing by mere inches. The slipstream of the passing silver fighter shaking Steiger's spinning canopy. "Recover! Recover!" Steiger's mind screamed, his veteran instincts overriding his panic. He neutralized the stick and kicked the opposite rudder hard to break the spin. The heavy nose of the Mustang dropped, the air catching the wings once more. The controls firmed up. He had lost 3,000 feet in seconds, but he was flying again. He didn't have time to catch his breath. The other 3 Americans were already diving on him, coordinating a textbook bracket attack. They were communicating, working as a seamless unit, while Steiger was entirely alone in a machine trying to kill him. "All right, you bastards," Steiger hissed through clenched teeth, sweat stinging his eyes. "Let's see how well you know your own beast." He pushed the nose down, picking up speed, waiting for the trailing Americans to commit to their dive. He watched his rearview mirror closely. 2 silver Mustangs were locked onto his 6 o'clock, their wings flashing as they armed their 650 caliber machine guns. Just as he saw the flicker of muzzle flashes in his mirror, Steiger slammed the throttle back to idle, kicked the rudder, and deployed 10 degrees of combat flaps, a maneuver strictly forbidden at these speeds in a Messerschmitt. The yellow Mustang decelerated with the violence of hitting a brick wall. The two pursuing Americans, diving at over 400 miles per hour, had no time to react to the sudden, drastic reduction in speed. They blew past Steiger on either side, one pulling up hard to avoid a mid-air collision, the other diving away in shock. For a fleeting, perfect second, an American P-51 filled Steiger's reflector gun sight. His thumb hovered over the red firing button on the stick. The American's blue-painted nose and the white star on the fuselage were perfectly centered. All it would take was a 1-second burst from the 4 heavy machine guns to tear the enemy's wing off. But Steiger hesitated. He was an ace, a killer of 82 men. But a sudden, strange paralysis gripped him. He was flying their plane. He felt the soul of Lieutenant Miller sitting right beside him in the cockpit. In that microsecond of hesitation, the moment passed. The American rolled hard and dove away out of range. Damn it. Steiger cursed his own weakness, shoving the throttle forward again. The fourth American, the flight leader who had overshot him initially, had completed a massive loop and was now dropping down from the sun, guns blazing. Thwack, thwack. 2 heavy armor-piercing rounds smashed into the yellow Mustang. One tore through the left wing, shredding a section of aluminum skin. The second struck the heavy armor plating right behind Steiger's head, the sheer kinetic force of the impact ringing his skull like a church bell. Steiger tasted blood where he had bitten his lip. He was out of tricks, carrying a full rear tank, and fighting 4 men who knew exactly how to hunt him. He rolled inverted and pulled the stick into his stomach, executing a punishing split S straight down toward the earth. The airspeed indicator wound up relentlessly. 400, 450, 500 miles per hour. The airframe began to vibrate, a high-pitched aerodynamic shriek drowning out the engine. He aimed for a thick bank of cumulus clouds hovering over the Ruhr Valley, praying the heavy anti-aircraft flak batteries below were paying attention. He glanced back. 2 Americans were following him down, but they were hesitant. They knew the danger of diving too deep into the German flak belts. At 5,000 feet, black puffs of smoke began to erupt in the sky ahead German 88mm anti-aircraft fire. Steiger dove straight into the flak barrage, holding his breath as shrapnel rattled against the armored underside of the fuselage. He punched into the dense gray moisture of the cloud bank. The world outside the canopy vanished into a milky white void. He held his heading for 3 agonizing minutes, flying solely on the American instruments, waiting for the armor-piercing rounds to tear through the fog and end him. But silence reigned. Only the steady, powerful thrum of the Packard Merlin engine kept him company. The Americans had broken off. Steiger slumped back in the seat, his chest heaving, his flight suit soaked in cold sweat. He looked out at the jagged hole in his left wing. He had survived, but he had never felt so utterly, hopelessly outmatched in his entire life. The yellow Mustang limped back to the Göttingen test facility, its engine sputtering slightly as Steiger coaxed it onto the grass runway. He taxied toward the hangars, cutting the engine the moment he was clear of the active strip. The 4-bladed propeller wound down, slicing through the air with a heavy swish, 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 before stopping entirely. Before Steiger could even unbuckle his harness, the ground crew swarmed the aircraft. Oberfeldwebel Weber was the first up on the wing, his eyes wide as he saw the bullet holes. "Herr Hauptmann, you are wounded?" Weber yelled, seeing the blood on Steiger's chin. "Just my pride, Weber," Steiger rasped, his hands shaking slightly as he removed his leather helmet. "And maybe my hope." He climbed down from the wing, his legs feeling like lead. A black Mercedes staff car was parked near the hangar doors. Standing beside it, chewing on a thick, unlit cigar, was a man whose presence made every mechanic on the airfield stand a little straighter. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the general of the fighter arm. Galland's piercing eyes assessed the battle damage on the yellow Mustang before shifting to Steiger. He did not look pleased. He wore his trademark, heavily modified uniform, his Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds glittering in the afternoon sun. "Hauptmann Steiger," Galland said, his voice gravelly and calm. "I am told you decided to engage elements of the 8th Air Force instead of conducting your flight tests." Steiger saluted crisply. Herr General, the engagement was forced. They ambushed Lieutenant Heinrich and myself at 25,000 feet. Galland walked slowly around the aircraft, running a finger over the jagged metal where the .50 caliber round had struck the armor plating. They nearly had you, a man with 82 victories, flying the best machine they have, and they nearly swatted you out of the sky. They had the numbers, Herr General. And Steiger hesitated, looking at the slick, aerodynamic lines of the fighter, and they did not have a full fuselage tank. Galland stopped and turned to Steiger. He pulled the cigar from his mouth. Report, Steiger. No pilot bravado. No Luftwaffe propaganda. I need the absolute truth to take back to Goering and the Führer. What is the weakness of the P-51 Mustang? Steiger looked at Weber, who was quietly inspecting the wing damage, and then back to Galland. The airfield was deathly quiet, as if the very wind had stopped to listen. Herr General, Steiger began, his voice steady but carrying a heavy, undeniable finality. Its weakness is that it requires a human to fly it, a human who gets tired, who makes mistakes, who can be frightened. The machine itself. The machine is flawless. Galland's brow furrowed. Flawless? Nothing is flawless, Steiger. You are telling me a mass-produced American fighter has no aerodynamic vice? I am telling you, it is an exterminator, Steiger said, stepping closer to the general, ignoring the boundaries of rank in the face of absolute reality. With a full rear tank, it is unstable. It will spin if pushed. But by the time they reach us, that tank is dry. When it is balanced, it outturns our Focke-Wulfs. It matches our Messerschmitts in a climb. It outdives anything we have. And it does this after flying for 3 hours. We scramble, fight for 20 minutes, and have to land for fuel. They can stay in our skies and hunt us all day. Galland stared at the bullet hole in the armor plating. His jaw muscles worked silently. But that is not the worst part, Herr General. Steiger continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Go on. Look at it. Steiger pointed to the sleek aluminum skin, the perfectly flushed rivets, the standardized parts. We build our fighters like artisan clockmakers, hand-fitting parts, struggling with material shortages, adjusting every panel. This machine, this is built by a factory line. It is perfectly standardized. The tolerances on the engine, the hydraulics, the electrical systems. It is a level of mass manufacturing we cannot comprehend. Steiger took a deep breath, delivering the words that would haunt the German High Command. If they can build one that flies this perfectly, they can build 10,000. They are not sending pilots to fight us, Herr General. They are sending an industry. We are bleeding out our finest men, and they are replacing them with kids from farms who are sitting in a machine that does half the thinking for them. The war in the air. It is already over. Silence stretched between them. Galland slowly put the cigar back in his mouth. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse Steiger of defeatism, because Galland, a pilot himself, knew the grim truth when he heard it. They will be bombing Berlin tomorrow in daylight, Galland said quietly, looking up at the sky. 1,000 bombers. And they will be escorted by 1,000 of these. He patted the yellow nose of the captured Mustang. Galland turned back to Steiger, his eyes hardening with the stubborn, fatalistic resolve of a soldier who knows he is doomed, but refuses to surrender. Your report is noted, Steiger, but until the sky falls on our heads, we fight. Oberfeldwebel Weber, Galland barked. Jawohl, Herr General. Weber snapped to attention. Patch that wing. Reload the guns. Harmonize the sights. Galland ordered. He turned to Steiger. You have tested how it flies. Tomorrow, you will test how it kills. We have a captured B-17 Flying Fortress. I want you to take this yellow bastard up and rip that bomber to pieces. I want to see exactly what its 6 heavy machine guns do to our armor. Yes, Herr General, Steiger replied, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. The ghost had been caught, and its secrets laid bare. But knowing the beast didn't mean they could slay it. It only meant they finally understood exactly how they were going to die. The sky over the Lüneburg Heath the next morning was a canvas of bleak, unbroken gray. The freezing air bit through Steiger's flight suit as he walked the perimeter of the captured Mustang. Overnight, Oberfeldwebel Weber and his crew had transformed the aircraft from a flying laboratory into an executioner's block. The 6 Browning M2 .50 caliber machine guns had been meticulously cleaned, oiled, and loaded with a devastating cocktail of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer ammunition. Steiger ran his gloved hand over the gun ports on the leading edge of the wing. He had faced these guns before. He had seen what they could do to a Messerschmitt, how a single well-placed burst could saw a wing clean off or ignite a fuel tank into a blinding fireball. But he had never fired them himself. The Luftwaffe relied heavily on 20mm and 30mm cannons, weapons that fired slow, heavy, explosive shells. The American philosophy was different: volume, velocity, and reach. The sights are harmonized for 300 yards, Herr Hauptmann, Weber said, stepping back from the wing. His face was drawn, exhausted from working through the night. The convergence zone will put all 6 streams of fire into a space no larger than a dinner plate. God help whatever is sitting in that zone. Let us hope it is only empty metal, Steiger muttered, climbing into the cockpit. His target for the day was a battered, obsolete Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress. Captured intact a year prior, the bomber had been stripped of its classified Norden bombsight and radar equipment, relegated to the shadowy Kampfgeschwader 200, the Luftwaffe's Special Operations Unit. Today, it was nothing more than a sacrificial lamb. A 2-man skeleton crew would fly the 4-engine behemoth to 10,000 feet over the unpopulated heath, trim the controls for level flight, and parachute to safety. Steiger was to then move in and unleash the Mustang's arsenal, documenting the destructive capability of the American guns against their own heavy armor. Steiger fired up the Packard Merlin engine. The cold air made the supercharger scream with a high-pitched mechanical fury. He taxied out, the massive propeller blasting the frost off the winter grass. Ahead of him, the lumbering dark green shape of the captured B-17, also adorned with German crosses, was already clawing its way into the low overcast. Taking off in the Mustang felt different this time. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical focus. He retracted the gear and pushed through the cloud layer, emerging into a blindingly bright arena of blue sky and blinding white cloud tops. Yellow Ghost, this is Fortress 1, a voice crackled in his headset. It was Hauptmann Becker, the pilot of the sacrificial bomber. We have reached altitude. Autopilot is engaged. Airspeed is a steady 160 miles per hour. We are abandoning the aircraft. Happy hunting, Steiger. Understood, Fortress 1. Good jump, Steiger replied. He throttled back and watched as 2 small, dark figures tumbled from the forward escape hatch of the B-17. Seconds later, twin white parachutes blossomed against the gray underbelly of the clouds below. The massive bomber flew on alone, a ghost ship sailing steadily toward the horizon. Steiger advanced the throttle and pushed the stick forward, sliding into position 2,000 yards behind the B-17. The sheer size of the 4-engine bomber was intimidating, even without its defensive gunners, tracking his every move. The B-17 was famously rugged, capable of absorbing horrific punishment, and still flying. German pilots often had to pump dozens of 20mm cannon shells into a fortress to bring it down. Let's see what your own teeth can do to you, Steiger whispered. He pushed the Mustang into a shallow dive, building his speed to 300 miles per hour. He flipped the gun switches. A red light blinked on the instrument panel. Guns armed. He closed the distance rapidly. 1,000 yards. 800. 600. The silhouette of the B-17 filled his reflector sight. He didn't aim for the fuselage, knowing the empty space would absorb the rounds. He aimed for the inboard right engine and the wing, root the structural heart of the beast. At 300 yards, perfectly in the convergence zone, Steiger pressed the red button on the control stick. The physical reaction of the aircraft was shocking. The Mustang shuddered violently, its airspeed instantly dropping by 10 miles per hour from the sheer recoil of the 6 heavy machine guns. A deafening, rhythmic roar filled the cockpit, smelling sharply of cordite and burned oil. 6 solid lines of white-hot fire erupted from the Mustang's wings, reaching out like the fingers of a vengeful god. The impact was catastrophic. Steiger watched in horrifying awe as the .50 caliber, armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into the B-17's wing. Metal didn't just dent, it evaporated. The concentrated stream of fire acted like a high-speed buzzsaw. Within a 2-second burst, the heavy aluminum skin of the bomber's wing was peeled back. The inboard engine exploded in a shower of black oil and orange flame as the incendiary rounds found the fuel lines. Steiger pulled off the trigger and banked hard to the left to avoid the debris field. He looked back over his shoulder. The B-17, renowned for its legendary toughness, was already dying. The right wing, its main spar severed by the sheer kinetic force of the American bullets, folded upward with a sickening metallic screech. The bomber violently snapped into a death spiral, a massive fireball erupting from the ruptured fuel tanks. It plummeted toward the clouds, a burning comet of twisted metal. Steiger sat back in his seat, his breathing shallow. It had taken less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds of gunfire to destroy an aircraft that routinely survived barrages of German anti-aircraft fire. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Americans didn't need heavy, slow-firing cannons. Their doctrine of high-velocity, concentrated machine gun fire was brutally, unarguably superior. He keyed his radio to contact the ground station. Göttingen Control. This is Steiger. Target destroyed. The weapons are. He paused, searching for the right word. The weapons are absolute. Before Göttingen could reply, a sudden, frantic transmission blasted through the radio channel, the voice distorted by panic and static. Achtung! Achtung! All airborne units. Heavy bomber formations entering grid sector Dora Heinrich. This is not a drill. Massive formations. Hundreds. Escorts are engaging. JG-3 and JG-27 are scrambling. Steiger's blood ran cold. He looked up, scanning the high-altitude contrails. Above him, at 25,000 feet, the sky was changing. What looked like thin white scratches on the blue canvas were multiplying. Tens, 50s, hundreds. It was the 8th Air Force, the 1,000-bomber raid Galland had warned him about. And they were flying right over the Lüneburg Heath, on a direct heading for Berlin. Steiger, this is Rosarius. The voice of his commander cut through the panicked chatter. Get out of there. You are in a captured aircraft wearing German markings. If our flak doesn't kill you, our own interceptors will, or the Americans will finish what they started yesterday. Dive to the deck and return to base immediately. Steiger pushed the nose of the Mustang down, preparing to dive for the safety of the clouds. But as he rolled, he saw something that froze his hand on the throttle. Dropping out of the bomber stream, trailing thick black smoke, was a German Messerschmitt Bf 109. Its canopy was shattered, and the pilot was fighting a losing battle to keep the burning aircraft stable. And diving right behind it, closing in for the kill, were 2 silver P-51 Mustangs. Steiger recognized the tail markings on the Bf 109. It was the Udet wing. These were kids, throwing themselves against an armored armada. Rosarius, Steiger said, his voice eerily calm. I cannot comply. Steiger, that is an order. You are a test pilot, not a frontline fighter. Steiger switched off his radio transmitter. He leveled the wings, pushed the throttle past the detent into war emergency power, and pulled back on the stick. The yellow Mustang rocketed upward, straight toward the chaotic, swirling inferno of the largest air battle in human history. The sky became a 3-dimensional slaughterhouse. Thousands of aircraft crisscrossed the heavens, weaving a deadly tapestry of white contrails, black flak bursts, and the brilliant, terrifying flashes of exploding metal. The roar of thousands of engines merged into a continuous physical vibration that rattled Steiger's teeth. He tore upward in the yellow Mustang, the Merlin engine screaming in protest as he pushed it to its absolute limits. Ahead of him, the wounded Bf 109 was spiraling downward, the 2 silver American Mustangs clinging to its tail like starving wolves. Steiger knew he couldn't shoot the Americans. The moment he fired those .50 caliber guns, he became a combatant in an enemy uniform, a spy, subject to execution if captured. Worse, he was in a machine he respected, flying against men who had designed it. But he could not let the German boy die. He didn't need to fire. He needed to use the Americans' own weapon against them. Confusion. Steiger rolled the heavy fighter onto its back and pulled into a punishing dive, aiming straight for the lead silver Mustang. The airspeed needle touched 500 miles per hour. The controls grew heavy, the airframe shrieking. The American wingman saw him first. Brake left, bandit, the pilot yelled over the open frequency that Steiger was monitoring. Wait, what the hell is that? The sight of their own perfectly designed fighter, painted in screaming yellow and branded with massive swastikas and iron crosses, hurtling toward them at 500 miles per hour, broke the Americans' concentration. It was a psychological shock. The lead American hesitated for a split second, pulling off his firing run on the crippled Bf-109 to face the new, bizarre threat. That second was all the German pilot needed. The burning Messerschmitt flipped over and plummeted into the safety of the cloud bank below. He's got our plane. The Krauts stole a Mustang, the American wingman shouted. Steiger pulled out of his dive, the G-forces crushing the air from his lungs. He rocketed past the two silver Mustangs, close enough to see the sheer disbelief on the face of the American flight leader. Engage him. Take him down. The two silver Mustangs hauled their noses around, dropping their external fuel tanks, and pursued Steiger. The dogfight of doppelgangers had begun again. But this time, Steiger was in his element. His rear fuselage tank was nearly empty, having burned the fuel during the gunnery test. The yellow beast was light, perfectly balanced, and terrifyingly agile. Steiger snapped into a brutal climbing turn. The two Americans tried to follow, but they were still carrying partial fuel loads. Their heavier aircraft mushed through the air, their turning circles wider. Steiger effortlessly pulled inside them, dancing the yellow Mustang through the sky with the grace of a master swordsman. He scissor-rolled, bleeding their energy, forcing them to overshoot. He turned again, always staying just out of their gun sights, putting his yellow nose on their tails, but never pressing the trigger. He was playing a lethal game of tag, demonstrating the absolute mastery of their own machine. I can't shake him, the American leader grunted over the radio. He's outflying us in our own ship. For 5 minutes, Steiger held them off, a lone yellow specter weaving through the silver armada. He felt a strange, wild exhilaration. He wasn't fighting for the Reich anymore. He wasn't fighting for medals. He was fighting for the pure, unadulterated joy of flight, bonded in a bizarre symbiosis with the ultimate machine. But gravity and war always collect their debts. As Steiger pulled out of a loop, attempting to disengage and dive for home, the airspace around him erupted. The German anti-aircraft batteries around Hanover had opened fire on the bomber stream. Crack. Boom. The sky turned black with 88 millimeters shrapnel. A wall of explosive metal tore through the formation. Flak did not care what uniform an aircraft wore, nor how beautifully it was engineered. A shell detonated less than 20 yards beneath Steiger's right wing. The shock wave flipped the heavy fighter onto its side. Shrapnel, jagged and white-hot, tore upward through the thin aluminum belly. Steiger heard a horrific tearing sound, followed immediately by the sickening hiss of escaping fluids. The instrument panel lit up like a Christmas tree. Oil pressure plummeted to zero. Coolant temperature spiked off the dial. The magnificent Packard V1650 Merlin engine, the heart of the beast, violently seized. A massive rod blew through the engine block, sending a geyser of boiling oil and gray smoke blindingly over the windshield. The propeller stopped dead, its 4 blades locking rigidly in the slipstream. The silence in the cockpit was sudden and absolute, save for the wind screaming past the canopy. The yellow Mustang was dead. Steiger wrestled with the heavy stick, trimming the nose down to maintain flying speed. He was at 15,000 feet. The aircraft was heavily damaged, rapidly losing altitude, and vibrating violently. He looked in his mirror. The 2 silver Mustangs had pulled up alongside him. They were 50 yards away. The American flight leader slid his canopy back. He looked at Steiger, then down at the smoking, seized engine of the yellow plane. The American didn't raise his guns. He simply raised 2 fingers to his brow, offering a crisp, solemn salute to the man who had outflown them. Then, he banked away, rejoining the bomber stream. Steiger smiled grimly, tasting blood. He reached up and grabbed the red emergency release handle for the Malcolm hood. He yanked it hard. The explosive bolts fired, and the canopy ripped away into the slipstream, sucking the smoke and heat out of the cockpit. He unbuckled his harness, stood up in the rushing wind, and kicked himself free of the dying beast. He tumbled through the freezing air for 5 seconds before pulling the ripcord. The white silk parachute deployed with a bone-jarring crack. Steiger hung suspended in the gray sky, drifting silently downward. Below him, the yellow Mustang entered a flat spin. He watched it fall, a blazing streak of color against the dark German earth. It smashed into a dense pine forest, erupting in a massive ball of orange flame and black smoke. The ghost was finally gone. Hours later, wrapped in a blanket in the back of a Wehrmacht truck, Steiger looked out at the ruins of a bombed-out village. General Gallen's words echoed in his mind. The war was lost. Steiger knew it with absolute certainty. They hadn't just been outproduced. They had been out-engineered. The P-51 was the harbinger of a new era, a technological leap that rendered courage and experience obsolete. Steiger had touched the future, and it had burned him. The story of captured aircraft during World War II remains one of the most fascinating and secretive chapters of aerial warfare. Units like the German Wanderzirkus Rosarius truly existed. Testing captured P-51S, Spitfires, and B-17S to find desperate vulnerabilities in Allied engineering, while Hauptmann Felix Steiger's harrowing realization captures the dramatic spirit of the era. The historical truth is undeniable. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and Packard Merlin engine, decisively shifted the balance of power in the skies over Europe, breaking the back of the Luftwaffe. The beast truly did conquer the eagle. If you were captivated by this deep dive into the untold aviation drama of World War II, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow history buffs, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling, real-life stories from the front lines of history. Comment below. Which WW2 aircraft do you think was the ultimate fighter?